close your eyes and let your mind be still, like the cold northern wind gently gliding across moss-covered cliffs and the quiet waves of distant seas. In the thin veil of memory and time, we begin our journey backward through history, where the past is not a collection of dusty old pages, but a living, breathing stream, as gentle and close as the breath of the earth and sky. This is not a tale of blood and fire, not the triumphant cries of Viking warriors conquering the world. Rather, it is a gentle, profound voyage where every detail, every image is told with patience and reverence, honoring the ancient souls who once lived, loved, and dreamed of a world beyond the horizon of their homeland. You will hear the sound of wind through ancient pine forests, the whispers of waves upon rocky shores, and the soft crackling of firewood in a small wooden house where Viking fathers and mothers told their children stories of mythology, of Odin, Thor, and Loki, not to inspire fear, but to nurture imagination and courage. We do not tell this story to trouble you with the violence of history, but to help you find peace within the quiet melodies of the past, so that when night falls, in the stillness before sleep, you might hear the faint echoes of those who once lived and left their mark upon that cold and distant land. And if your heart truly resonates with these stories, if your soul finds comfort in these silent chapters of history, then we invite you to walk with us, not out of mere curiosity, but because you have found a place where your mind can rest and your heart can listen to the ancient whispers still lingering somewhere in the wind.
Before the Viking longships sliced through the misty waves of distant shores, before their names stirred fear in foreign lands, the ancestors of the Norse people lived quietly, close to the earth and sea that shaped them. Nestled in clustered villages beside deep fjords and shadowed by towering mountains, their lives were defined not by conquest, but by survival, resilience, and an intimate bond with the land itself. They were farmers and fishermen, herders and hunters, craftsmen and storytellers, bound together not by empires, but by kinship, tradition, and a deep respect for the forces of nature that surrounded them. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, families endured the long winters and brief summers with patience and skill. They read the changing skies and the restless tides with the attentiveness of those who understood that nature was both a provider and the force beyond their control. Men spent their days tending livestock, guiding nets into icy waters where silver-scaled fish shimmered like stars, or forging tools by the glow of a crackling forge. Women spun wool into fabric, shaped clay into vessels, and preserved food with wisdom passed down from their mothers, ensuring survival when the land turned cold and unforgiving. Children, wild and curious, followed their elders through forests, gathering firewood and herbs, or learning the sacred art of storytelling beside the hearth. For them, every story of a god or a hero was not merely entertainment, but a lesson, a map for living with courage and cunning in a world that offered no guarantees. There were no grand palaces, no written chronicles to record their names. Instead, their legacy was carved into stone runes and whispered from one generation to the next in songs and sagas that would one day echo through history. Though they lived in simple wooden homes thatched with straw, their artistry and craftsmanship adorned their world, from serpent-carved doorframes to finely worked jewelry and tools forged with precision. They were not merely survivors of the cold north. They were creators, thinkers, and dreamers whose quiet existence was filled with dignity and meaning. And though the outside world knew little of them, the Norse people listened to the winds and the waves, finding in them stories far older and deeper than any crown or kingdom. Their lives were threads in a tapestry that was just beginning to unfurl, the quiet prelude to an age that would one day reshape the known world.
No single moment marked the dawn of the Viking Age. There was no trumpet blast, no proclamation echoing across the fjords. Instead, change crept in slowly, like the rising tide, as the Norse communities quietly shifted from isolated settlements into societies restless with growing ambition. Their population increased, placing strain on the limited arable land and resources. Inheritance disputes brewed beneath the surface of family gatherings, and the harsh winters stretched the limits of survival. Young men seeking land and legacy found themselves hemmed in by mountains and sea, and in their longing, they turned their gaze outward. The sea, once a boundary that marked the edge of their world, became instead a bridge to opportunity. From the whispering halls of longhouses, stories of distant lands rich with treasure and ripe for the taking drifted like smoke through the rafters. These were lands where monasteries stood unguarded, where wealth glittered within reach, and where men could carve their names into legend. But the first voyages were not grand invasions. They were hesitant, almost experimental. Small groups of sailors testing the horizons, driven not by hatred, but by hunger, not by greed, but by necessity. In the misty dawn of these first raids, the Norse found not just riches, but revelation. The world beyond the waves was larger, softer, and less prepared for their arrival than they had ever imagined. As their long ships grew longer and their sails broader, a subtle transformation stirred within the Norse identity. They began to see themselves not only as farmers and fishermen, but as adventurers, traders, and, when fate demanded it, raiders. And though they carried weapons, they also carried dreams of finding their place in a world that stretched beyond the cold embrace of the North. This was a turning point in their history, a restless yearning kindled not by the desire to destroy, but by the quiet belief that beyond the familiar fjords, something waited, something worth risking everything to find. And so it was upon these restless waves of ambition and necessity that the longships first slipped their moorings and sailed into history. These were no ordinary boats. They were the cutting edge of Norse craftsmanship. Long, narrow vessels of oak, sleek and sturdy, designed to glide effortlessly over both open seas and shallow rivers. Their dragon-headed prows were not merely for show. They were protectors, carved to frighten hostile spirits and strike awe into the hearts of distant shores. With a single square sail and banks of powerful oars, these ships could slice through the mist like a silent blade. Crewed by oarsmen whose arms were tempered by cold winters and hard labor, they moved with an eerie swiftness, capable of appearing from the fog and vanishing before a cry for help could echo across the cliffs. The first raids were small, almost hesitant. A handful of ships, a few dozen men, striking monasteries and isolated coastal villages. Their targets were chosen not for the glory of conquest, but for their vulnerability. Monasteries, rich in gold and silver, yet guarded only by prayers and humble monks, made for irresistible prey. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 would become the event most historians mark as the dawn of the Viking Age, a brutal awakening for the Christian world. The Vikings did not understand their actions as sacrilegious. To them, it was survival, opportunity, and perhaps destiny. They carried not only weapons, but curiosity, seeking not only gold, but stories, knowledge, and fame.
With every successful raid, the whispers of Norse ambition spread. Tales of easy plunder and unguarded shores filled the longhouses of Scandinavia. More ships were built, more warriors gathered. What began as necessity soon became legend. And so the quiet waters of the north became pathways of both terror and trade, and the longships became the harbingers of a new age.
In the year 793, beneath a sky thick with mist and uncertainty, the Viking Age announced itself to the world with a thunderclap of horror. It was on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England, where peace and prayer had reigned for generations, that the Northmen made their intentions known. The monastery, home to monks who spent their days illuminating manuscripts and whispering sacred prayers, was utterly unprepared for the terror that would descend from the sea. The longships arrived in the gray light of dawn, their dragon-headed prows slicing through the surf like silent omens. The raiders disembarked with swift precision, moving through the monastery as both storm and shadow. What they found within those stone walls was wealth beyond imagining: golden crosses, jeweled chalices, and books of priceless knowledge. But more importantly, they found no resistance. The monks, defenseless and untrained for war, were caught between their prayers and their fear. Some were slain where they knelt, others fled into the hills, their cries of terror mingling with the smoke rising from burning scrolls and shattered altars. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the largest nor the bloodiest attack of the Viking Age, but it was the most symbolic. It shattered the illusion of security that had sheltered the British Isles, and sounded a warning bell heard throughout Christendom. Word of the attack spread swiftly across Europe, carried by merchants and monks alike, reaching the ears of kings who now looked to their coastlines with dread. But for the Norse raiders, Lindisfarne was more than a victory, it was a revelation. The wealth of the Christian world was ripe for the taking, its guardians soft and unsuspecting. What began as a singular event soon became a pattern. Other monasteries, coastal villages, and trading ports followed. Raids grew bolder and better organized, evolving from mere survival into an enterprise of wealth and reputation. Yet it would be a mistake to see the Vikings only as marauders. Alongside the sword came the merchant's coin. Viking traders ventured beyond the British Isles, down the rivers of Eastern Europe, and into the markets of Byzantium and the Arab world. Their ships carried not only warriors, but furs, amber, walrus ivory, and finely crafted weapons, goods that connected the distant north to the broader currents of global trade. Lindisfarne was the spark, but the fire of the Viking Age would burn far and wide, reshaping the political, economic, and cultural landscape of Europe. And in the quiet spaces between the raids, Norse families still gathered around their hearths, telling the tales of gods and heroes, perhaps unaware that their own deeds were becoming the sagas of tomorrow. While the Western world reeled from Viking raids, a quieter and more intricate journey was unfolding to the east. The Norse, now called Varangians by those they encountered, turned their longships inland, navigating the winding rivers of what we now know as Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Here, the waterways became roads, and the dense forests opened paths to wealth beyond imagining. The rivers of the east, the Neva, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, became arteries of commerce, connecting the frozen north to the wealthy heart of Byzantium. Along these routes, Viking traders, warriors, and settlers founded outposts that would one day become cities of renown. Among these, the city of Novgorod rose from the wild lands as a center of Norse Slavic commerce and culture. But these voyages were not simple. The Varangians braved treacherous rapids, negotiated with wary Slavic tribes, and fought rival warlords.
Some expeditions vanished into the forests, swallowed by conflict or the sheer remoteness of the land. Yet those who survived found themselves at the doorstep of one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, Constantinople. To the Vikings, Constantinople, known to them as Miklagard, the great city, was a marvel beyond imagination. Towering walls, bustling markets filled with silks, spices, and gold, and the soaring domes of the Hagia Sophia dazzled eyes accustomed to the rugged beauty of the north. Some Norse warriors, captivated by the city's wealth and splendor, entered the service of the Byzantine emperor as part of the elite Varangian Guard, fearsome soldiers loyal to their new master, yet forever marked by their northern origins. These Varangians left their names etched into the marble of Constantinople, scratched in runes along the walls of the Hagia Sophia, a silent testament to the far reach of the Viking spirit. Yet even as they found trade and service in the east, the Norse never forgot their roots. Each journey down the rivers of the Rus was also a journey home, laden with silver coins, silk garments, and stories that would one day be told beside the fires of distant Scandinavian longhouses. Thus, the Vikings of the East were not merely raiders, but bridge builders between worlds, between the wild forests of the north and the golden streets of Byzantium, between the simple villages of their birth and the great empires of the south. The rivers of the East did not flow with blood alone. They flowed with ambition, with commerce, and with the enduring human desire to explore what lies beyond the horizon.
As the 9th century unfolded, Viking ambitions grew larger, and their raids became more organized, culminating in the arrival of what history would call the Great Heathen Army. Unlike the small raiding parties of earlier years, this was a massive force, numbering in the thousands, drawn from across Scandinavia and united by a common purpose: conquest. In 865, the Great Heathen Army landed on the shores of East Anglia in England, led by legendary figures such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnar's son, and Ubba, all said to be sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. These Viking warlords sought not just riches, but revenge, particularly against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had executed Ragnar years before. What followed was a series of calculated campaigns that shook the foundations of Anglo-Saxon England. Unlike earlier Viking raids, the Great Heathen Army did not strike and flee. Instead, they wintered on English soil, built fortified camps, and launched coordinated attacks on key kingdoms. Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia fell in quick succession, their rulers unable to withstand the discipline and strategy of the Viking war machine. The fall of York in 866 was a particularly symbolic victory. Once a Roman stronghold and a center of Christian learning, it now became Jorvik, a Norse stronghold that blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon cultures. In this new Viking kingdom, Norse rulers governed over Anglo-Saxon subjects, and markets buzzed with goods from both worlds. But the story did not end in conquest alone. Over time, the Viking warlords began to settle, marry, and raise families on English soil. Their children spoke both Old Norse and Old English. Their homes reflected a fusion of two worlds, and the once clear lines between invader and native blurred into something new. Yet resistance remained. In the southern kingdom of Wessex, a young king named Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, would rise to challenge the Viking advance. Through a combination of military reform, strategic fortifications, and alliances, Alfred slowed the Viking conquest and defended his kingdom against overwhelming odds. The struggle between Wessex and the Vikings would set the stage for the eventual unification of England, a legacy that would echo through the centuries. But in this moment of history, the Great Heathen Army stood as a testament to the Vikings' transformation from raiders to rulers, from shadows on the horizon to kings who shaped the land beneath their feet.
As the tides of history moved onward, the Viking Age gradually gave way to a new chapter in the story of Europe. The fierce raiders who once struck fear into distant shores had settled into the lands they once pillaged, their descendants becoming rulers, farmers, traders, and poets. Across Scandinavia and beyond, the echoes of their exploits continued to shape nations and inspire legends. The Viking spirit, born of harsh winters and restless seas, found new expression in the laws of emerging kingdoms, the architecture of towns, and the tales sung by skalds in quiet halls. Though the long ships were pulled onto shore and the axes laid to rest, the legacy of exploration, resilience, and bold ambition endured. In places like Normandy, Iceland, and even the distant shores of North America, the Norse legacy planted seeds that would influence history for centuries. Viking bloodlines mingled with those of their former foes, creating cultures rich in diversity and shared heritage. The Danelaw, once a battleground of conquest, became a region where two peoples learned to coexist. Constantinople's Varangian Guard stood as a reminder of the Norse presence in the east, where trade and service replaced the sword. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vikings is not found in the conquests they won or the territories they ruled, but in the human spirit they embodied, a spirit that dared to ask, what lies beyond the horizon? Today, their stories continue to whisper through the winds of the fjords, across the stone ruins of their settlements, and in the hearts of those who seek to understand the restless journey of humankind. Whether as fierce warriors, skilled navigators, or curious explorers, the Vikings remind us that history is not a straight path, but a vast sea, and we are all sailors searching for distant shores. As we close this chapter, may the echoes of the past remind us to embrace both courage and curiosity in our own journeys. For the saga of humanity is far from over, and each of us holds a thread in its endless tapestry.